You ready? Great, okay, fantastic, right, thank you. Welcome everybody to the Public Accountability meeting on the 30th of July. I think probably, could we just start by going round the room and people can just explain who you are and what you do, if that's all right. Andrew, do you want to?
I'll start.
Yeah.
Andrew Brody, the Chief Fire Officer.
And can I just say congratulations, Andrew, on being the permanent Chief Fire
Thank you very much for selecting me.
Thank you.
John Foster, Interim Deputy Chief Fire Officer.
Dave Winspear, Head of Prevention and Protection.
Detective Chief Inspector Jim Glass, one of the crime commanders.
Kieran Irvin, Temporary ACC Specialist Ops.
Annette Anderson, Assistant Chief Constable for Local Policing.
I'm Rob Bowles, I'm the Chair of the Police Federation in North Yorkshire.
Not Lee Smith.
Not Lee Smith.
Will Naylor, Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner.
Tom Thorpe, Policy and Scrutiny Manager to the PFCC.
Hello, I'm Lisa Winwood, I'm the Chief Constable of North Yorkshire Police.
And Julian Mulligan, Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner. Have we got any apologies? Don't think we do.
There are a couple there on the second sheet that I just handed up.
Okay,
on
thank
the
well,
back.
Kieran's here.
The second one.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, apologies. Phil Kane and Simon Dennis. Kieran is here. Okay, great, thank you. The minutes and the meeting and the actions are all on the internet, so if anybody wants to have a look at the discussions, then they are on the link. So the third item is questions from the public. We've got one question from the Crime and Disorder Select Committee from Craven District Council. The short answer is yes, I am assured and satisfied, but that will be covered in detail during presentation later on. Okay, so onto the substantive agenda items. The first thing is over to you, Jim, I think.
Thank you. So I've been asked to provide assurance in relation to how in North Yorkshire Police we manage the breadth of investigations, the volume of investigations, both in relation to individual victims and the community as a whole. So I've got some slides to provide a little bit of context and we'll then go into elements of assurance. The first thing to say is that managing investigations in North Yorkshire Police is based around the College of Policing in relation to the Professionalising Investigation Programme, or more commonly known as PIP. This is an accreditation to practice, so victims, offenders and the judiciary and the wider public have confidence that the investigators are properly trained and properly accredited. So our structures and our allocation procedures are based around that College of Policing accreditation structure. So we, broadly speaking, in local policing have PIP 1 crimes and PIP 2 crimes, and then in the middle we have a little bit of flexibility between the two crime types. All crime that's reported, whether it's direct to the control room, to a police officer on the street, to a PCSO, or various meetings that should generate an instant for the matter to be recorded as a crime via the control room processes. That is where the oversight of investigation starts, both in terms of thrive for threat, harm, risk and vulnerability, and also solvability. And what I mean by solvability is, are there lucrative lines of inquiry that may help us establish the truth? So from that, a crime is allocated into those three broad groups. Community crimes.
Can I
yes.
ask a question? Is that okay? In that top box, Jim, you've got quote unquote filed first time. For a cynical member of the public, they may think that's a very easy, convenient way to bin off, they might say, any crime that sounds difficult or complicated or whatever reason. Which is, in one way, what it is if you don't have any lucrative lines of authority, say. But can you explain a bit more about that process and explain roughly what might stop a crime getting through that process and what might get it.
Okay,
Can I
so
just to tip into that. So there obviously there have been examples of neighbouring forces who've in effect had targets around getting rid of crimes, if you like, for lack of a better terminology, and you know, we've been quite robust in North Yorkshire saying we don't have such targets, but I think the suspicion remains that that's the case.
no, various levels of assurance. So if a crime, for example, is screened out in the control room, there is a set script based around certain criteria for that to take place. As you say, there's no crime types and there's no automation in that process. It's always a professional judgment through the various layers of the organisation. But even if a crime is initially screened out, that doesn't mean to say that's the end of it. So I'll talk later on in the slides around crime series and chasing the criminals, not just the crimes. So at daily management meetings, for example, we will be aware that there's been some crimes which may have been initially screened out, but actually we want forensics, our regional forensic colleagues, to go to, because we're aware that it's part of a linked series crime. So an example would be, we've had some vehicle offences in the Harrogate area which fall part of a linked series where we have what we believe is effectively a local gang. Now that may not be to the knowledge of the control room operator at that time, but we will then pick it up and pursue house-to-house inquiries. So although it may initially be screened out, that doesn't mean to say it won't be looked at as part of a series.
And I think it's important to say that if something is screened out is a really unfortunate term, really, but that doesn't mean to say it won't be recorded as a crime.
Oh, absolutely
I think
not, no.
we just need to make sure that people understand that if it's a crime, it will be recorded, regardless of what action is then taken to deal with it.
But more importantly, if subsequent, as a result of intelligence, or as a result of a member of the public coming forward, or as a result of some other analytical work or other intervention, that crime can always be brought back and the victim hopefully updated that actually we've worked out who's done it.
I think just to add, we're probably guilty of using some Home Office technical language in terms of the description of a crime being screened in or screened out, because that's the two routes that a crime can follow, and that comes once the crime has been recorded and assessed for the right crime type, and then that decision to screen a crime out, i.e. not to pursue an immediate investigation, is one that's taken by somebody who's got particular experience and accreditation within their own right around the Home Office counting rules and all of the processes that go there. So it really is a values-based decision-making process to decide whether or not we can conduct that initial investigation now. But as Jim's described, if we get 10 of a particular type, even though individually they might not be solvable, we would look to link the method being used back to broader crime series. So there is an investigation takes place, but it's a desk-based investigation which decides whether there are further lines of inquiry to follow, and that's at the point at which something is screened in for further work or not.
How much? So if someone might have a hunch there's a series, so I'm thinking, I don't know, a rural burglary or something where pressure washers have got nicked or some power tools or something. In and of itself, no one saw it, no CCTV, there's no knowledge around it apart from something's being nicked. My professional judgment imply, well, actually there's been a number of those in that area over the last 2 weeks that might come together, and I'll pass it on to a different team to take a look at in more depth.
This is where the local safe neighbourhood inspector and their team, the local intelligence inspector and their team would work together to identify actually is this an isolated incident or part of a linked series.
What's it, when does they say, so something gets to the control room, it's screened out for good reason probably, but without the context. Where does it go to then get picked up by that second sort of safety net, as it were?
Well, obviously each incident is geographically located within the storm system, so there's oversight there for the local officers to be able to understand what incidents and crimes have taken place. And so, for example, in the commands, there will also be not just daily management meetings in the morning to pick up anything that may have fallen through, but also weekly meetings where we thematically look at crime and criminals. So we have one on a Monday morning where all the Safe and Neighbourhood inspectors dial in. We've got the Investigation Hub DI dialing in, and we've got the Intelligence DI, Chief Inspector or Superintendent. We go through any local issues which may be linked to that. And the Safe and Neighbourhood inspectors are quite regularly asked, is there anything you wish us to be aware of from a local perspective?
Can I just from a cross-border point of view, I mean, there was an incident, just happened to be in the area that I live in recently, where there was an incident in North Yorkshire, and a very similar incident in Lancashire, and the two forces were not communicating with one another. How do you mitigate those types of risks to make sure that if in those border areas, when you've got something that happens on one side of the border that is almost identical to something that happens on the other side of the border, that you swap notes?
No, I mean, so the key to that is intelligence and linkages. So at Craven we've got very good intelligence relationships with both West Yorkshire and Lancashire. Only today I've been discussing in relation to a matter over there, and the first task is, right, let's see if these individuals are part of a West Yorkshire organised crime group for an incident that took place overnight. So in order to ensure that the dots are joined together between the forces across border, that will be something for intelligence to link in with. Likewise, I'm aware that we've had a spate of I think 4 burglaries in the Craven area where firearms have been stolen as part of the burglary, so we're linked in relation to the officers on the proactive team in West Yorkshire, so they are there. I accept that it could be better.
They weren't there though, it was only because somebody emailed the local commander to tell them of that incident that linkage was made. So my point is, systemically, how can we improve that? It's something the public asks us all the time, particularly people who live in those border areas, that partnership working between different police forces and understanding that.
Yeah, I think there's room for improvement, definitely. There will be occasions where we're made aware of something which we previously weren't made aware of, and we pick up on it. I think that there's various layers of that. First and foremost, local intelligence, field intelligence officers out in Craven, local intelligence officers regularly in contact with their colleagues over the border. In terms of more formal processes, we obviously have the regional organised crime for the more serious matters, but in terms of local, more sort of less organised criminality, we're very reliant on those personal and professional relationships at local intelligence level to make sure that we don't miss anything.
I think there's particular improvement to be made across the Lancashire Cumbria side, because the way the force is structured and the way UK policing is structured is that they go from local safer neighbourhood to force level to region. Now we sit in the Yorkshire and Humber region, so for those serious and organised criminals who might cross the line into Keighley and Bradford, we've got those ROCU links in place for us to help us smooth the path. And we've got probably closer links with the north-northeast because we form part of that broader northeast region. So that border vulnerability from sort of Stokesley into Middlesbrough is much more closely managed, and probably in a way we probably need to look maybe more closely in terms of how we close those border vulnerabilities around that type of criminality. When we all realise criminals don't respect force boundaries. I mean, they're artificially applied, aren't they, by us? But there's a constraint there, and I think it's a valuable point that we can take away in terms of that sort of calm across the line into the Lancashire side.
And it's also though interesting, isn't it, because different forces have different priorities as well. So if we've got a priority for one thing in North Yorkshire, it doesn't mean to say that West Yorkshire or Lancashire or Cleveland or whoever it is shares that priority, and that can be a bit of a challenge sometimes as well.
It can. I mean, I'm grateful for the work that Jim does, because I mean, your commander envelops nearly all of those borders in terms of that sort of shape around the force, and there's a lot goes on to sort of build those personal and professional relationships with the intelligence function in an effort to try and influence those other forces to, if not take the lead, but support us in our action as we go over the line in order to make arrests and similar.
So moving on to the next slide. This slide is merely an illustration of the increase in volume of recorded crime particularly in relation to cyber crimes and non-recent sexual crimes. So this sort of illustrates that we have had an increase in demand, but it's also an increase in complexity of investigations. So obviously non-recent sexual offences take quite some considerable time to investigate because of a lack of forensic opportunities, and that invariably takes more time. And in relation to cyber-enabled crimes, the issue there is the forensics, the timescales in terms of breaking into the phone if they're encrypted, doing the download, whether it's locally or sourced out, and then the subsequent review by the OIC. So this leads to an increase in timescales that it takes to update victims in relation to where their crimes are going, and it can lead to an increase in workload of officers as well. So there are some figures up there which just indicate that a lot of the crime types are on the increase, but particular ones of note are non-recent and cyber-enabled.
So just so the public understands, the cyber-enabled is what?
Okay, so it's any mobile device which is connected to the internet, laptop, PC, whereby as part of the context of the crime or as part of the method of committing that crime, a device is used. So that could be anything from online grooming of children to trolling, which amounts to criminal harassment, through to videoing the offence in question. So anything where there is a digital device where there can be evidence which will point to the truth.
So what proportion of crimes includes that now then?
Well, I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but what I would say is, having looked at a lot of applications for mobile phone downloads, a great many crimes now do have that as a reasonable line of inquiry. So if you have a nighttime assault then against two drunk people, then I wouldn't consider it a reasonable line of inquiry to download the victim's phone. But if you have a long-standing terrible form of stalking or harassment, and the perpetrator is pointing out that actually the victim isn't a victim, then we would have two phones there to download. So that can increase the cyber sort of e-forensic workload. So I think the answer to your question is, in North Yorkshire we will comply with legislation, the Criminal Procedures Investigation Act, and we will only be downloading devices where it's reasonable line of inquiry for that offence.
So this has sort of hit the headlines recently,
Yeah.
hasn't it? So I mean, I think that we'll ask separate questions about that at a separate time, because we've got a lot of questions about that, as you can imagine, particularly because I have the national co-lead on victims, and are particularly concerned around the impact on sexual assault. So I think that is an action to come out of this meeting, if we may, to get some.
It's already in train.
I know it's already in train, but it needs saying in public. I think that we need some assurance around how the police are accessing that type of information.
I mean, I would say just in terms of short answer for today, that the force is following the NPCC guidance. I
think that's where the issue is.
It is, but we want to reassure that the guidance being that we should achieve proper consent and inform our victims, of the totality of the picture. We've reinforced and are doing our level best to make sure that that is the case. We're awaiting obviously further legal opinion and advice to help make the situation better, but we didn't want to be in a position where we weren't adhering to national guidance, and that would then potentially put prosecution to risk.
That's right. The discussions are around the national guidance, not about how it's being used.
Exactly.
It is around
Yeah.
So the next slide, in terms of the current picture of the criminal investigation in North Yorkshire Police, there's a graph there and some numbers, but basically there, as you would imagine, there are a split between the numbers of volume crime and serious mandatory crime investigations, and those that sit somewhere in the middle. And I'll just put a little bit of context around priority crime sitting at pit 1 or pit 2. If you've got a GBH where the offender is caught on CCTV, they're detained at the scene and are identified. That's notwithstanding the nature of the injury to the victim, that's relatively straightforward and may go to a PC or a detective in the investigation hub. You could have alternatively a series of common assaults in a care or position of trust environment, which would naturally go to the detectives in the CID. So we always make a judgment call in relation to the threat, harm and risk complexity of the investigation versus the offence type. It's not simply a case of that offence type is dealt with by that department. It's very much more of a bespoke decision. And the other thing I'd like to say at this point is the investigation hubs are managed by detective sergeants who are managed by detective inspectors. The CID are managed by detective sergeants, managed by detective inspectors. So we do place and understand that the importance of non-serious crime in North Yorkshire comes under that detective scrutiny, because we understand the impact those other offences can have on not only the victim but also the wider community. So you are getting PIP 2 oversight of PIP 1 crimes. That's how we're structured.
On that note, Jim, so it's really helpful to understand the process it goes through to understand which of those boxes a crime might end up in, if any. Is there then a secondary discussion around the scale of the resources attached to a particular crime or a group of crimes?
Yeah.
It might be. So you might have a crime that's of great harm to an individual, and you might have a set of crimes that are of great harm to a community. And how do you sort of, resources being finite, how do you try and manage the different kinds of needs of a victim or a community or whatever it might be?
Okay, so in terms of, I'll give two examples. So we have a detective downstairs in Northallerton who has got a very serious crime which they're investigating, multiple victims and horrendous offending. They've been, because of that demand without investigation, they've been given space and time to focus on that one. So that's how we allocate time as resource as well as just numbers. And then on the flip side, we had a link series crime of vehicle offences in an area of Harrogate, which was really upsetting for the community members. They should be able to park their car outside and not have it broken into. So as part of that, we allocated a shift from the CID actually, and we put out capture cars and we started to pull together the individual pieces of the investigation. So on the one hand, you can have some very serious offending sat with one person because they need time and space to be able to work through all the evidence carefully, and on the other sense you can have a series of vehicle crimes which we surge into to try and work out who's doing it to prevent it. So it's almost that borderline between reacting to a series and trying to get in front of it and reduce the demand in the first place. So
How are you getting on with those vehicle crimes then?
We're getting there slowly. It's not as good as it should be. What's interesting though is when you uncover and turn that stone over, that some of the people involved are criminally exploited themselves, and some of the people who are coordinating that criminality have some significant organised capability. So we may come across offenders who are committing a sort of volume crime, but they themselves are criminally manipulated into it. So we, that puts it.
How do you deal with the ethics of something like that then?
Okay, I'll give an example. Yes, last week I instructed a youth to be arrested for burglary. A farm building had been broken into and damage caused by means of fire. It was known from the outset that child had some additional needs and difficulties. So worked with social care, and the outcome of that was they were dealt with for one element of the crime, but they've actually also ended up on a child protection plan for emotional abuse. So the conversations I have with social care are, they have to deal with the child, I have to deal with their behaviour. That they're not exclusive. You can try and sort both out. So morally, it's difficult to deal with somebody as a perpetrator when they're a victim of emotional abuse. But that's the nuances and complexities of what we're dealing with. We do try and be compassionate, because behind all these numbers are obviously people. So moving on, just a very brief slide. We've got different departments. So the Investigation Hub and CID, as I've discussed. We also have Organised Crime Unit. They play a really vital part because obviously whilst they're dealing with the criminally sophisticated gangs, all their activity has to take place somewhere, and it's the corrosive effect on the community of which they operate. So there's linkages between safe neighbourhood inspectors and organised crime. There's intelligence being passed locally to the force and obviously regionally. So organised crime, although they're not optically very visible, they do a lot of work behind the scenes to stop the corrosive effect of those crimes on society. Likewise, economic crime units.
Sorry, Jim, sorry.
That's okay.
So on the organised crime, you've got human trafficking and modern slavery in there. The largest ever court case against under that legislation was actually in Lincolnshire and was a set of rural. It was a rural exploitation. People have a sort of in there, largely because the publicity around it is around sort of nail bars and car washes and all of that sort of stuff. It's trying to sort of understand what's going on in areas where you might not necessarily think these things are going on, and the public being able to, provide that essential intelligence and information that the police might need. The fire and rescue service has a role to play in this as well, and there's been some successful examples of firefighters going into premises and identifying vulnerabilities and risk factors, and it's trying to sort of understand that as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of crime hidden in plain sight, and all I would say is we are reliant on members of the public helping us. If they see something that doesn't sit right with them, I would encourage them to tell us. And likewise, rural communities, there can be a lot of very serious crime taking place out there, not just in terms of modern slavery and human trafficking. And obviously in terms of the organised crime unit, there's the human trafficking element of child criminal exploitation. So, we've had, they're now formalised as the expedite teams, but we've had a county lines team running for quite some time in Harrogate. And, we've moved on from binary statistics. We're looking at, the number of referrals, the number of disruptions we're submitting, the amount of intelligence that we're gaining. A lot of these children are going back to their host force areas with, having been identified as in need of safeguarding. And obviously there's the other side of it, which is the drug seizures, the cash seizures, the asset seizures, and arresting and trying to prosecute people for possession of intent to supply. So that all takes place somewhere. Our response to that has not been just to look at the opportunities to catch and convict. It's disruption, prevent it in the first time, and actually get some safeguarding outcomes.
Just to say on that, one of the things that's picked up around the sort of the whole of the organised crime piece is we're a significant importer of organised criminality in terms of the sort of the end of the line, particularly around county lines and other types of activity. We invited the national team in to come and peer review our performance and our approach, and Will kindly was part of the initial interview arrangement there. We've come out reasonably well. There's a few things for us to learn, particularly in terms of sort of broadening out our approach, but we're not going to rest on our laurels in that respect. The organised crime unit, probably towards the end of the summer, will be increasing in size to enable us to tackle that more. And that's not because we want to take more drugs off the street and we want to catch and convict more people, which inevitably we always do, but we want to really dig into that sort of vulnerability aspect around there with those people who are exploited and either trafficked into the area or particularly involved in forced labour in certain areas, and that's probably an area that we need to do a little bit more on. Our focus has been really around that criminal exploitation in relation to drugs, sex work and similar, but we do acknowledge that there is a forced labour element, particularly in the rural sides of the rural parts of the county.
Given that, Jim, not just the scale, and the sort of county lines is just bigger than it's been before, are there now greater challenges if you've got children coming from wherever, West Midlands, trying to get information about where they've come from, who they are? Is that just a sort of another workload in itself on the side of it because they're young, because they're out of force?
Yeah, I mean, we try and establish the truth so we can make lives a bit better. The issue is invariably they have mobile phones with them. Invariably they have, a complicated and challenging past. They need to be dealt with for what we find, so what we see we'll deal with, but we'll always see it through the lens of, well, actually, what's caused this in the first place. But you're right, it does increase the length of investigations. There's some charts later on where, particularly in county, the length of investigations are being skewed because the amount of time it's taken us to unpick the county lines, both in terms of prosecuting for possession with intent to supply, in terms of identifying the drugs, doing the debt lists on the phones, doing all the assets and the cash, but also the referrals and safeguarding mechanisms. So it is, I'm grateful for you picking up on it. It is complicated, and it's not, you can't do it in a day.
It's also not to forget that not just about crime investigation, but broader safeguarding. There's an increased proliferation of private children's homes right the way across the country, and North Yorkshire's not immune to that.
No.
So we've been working through the safeguarding teams with those care homes and the owners of those care homes to ensure that as children come into the county on placement, often emergency placements, that information is shared with the force at an early stage so that we can then make sure the right links are made through local safeguarding and local children's social care, because those children are the ones who are most at risk of being involved in at-risk and risky behaviour when they come into the force area. So we're trying to really get upstream on that as well to prevent the criminal investigation coming and try and manage the safeguarding impact.
So if a child arrives in North Yorkshire to supply drugs, what happens to them then? Do you just, when you put them on a train, what happens to them?
No. I mean, we obviously investigate the criminality, and as part of investigating the criminality, we get the context of their vulnerability. So we have to deal with both the child as a child, potentially in need, whether we need to engage with out-of-duty social workers, EDT, if it's out of hours, whether we have to deal with the person with parental responsibility. They're subject to all the child legislation that safeguards them. So on the one hand, we have to deal with what they've been doing or been forced to do, but on the other hand, we can't just release them onto a train, because then we have our own duties and responsibilities.
The Met now have a team of people, don't they, that actually go and retrieve their children?
We're exploring how we can try and make something like that work here.
Yeah.
Obviously different challenges in terms of the metropolitan approach and the transport infrastructure and so on. Compared to the sort of more rural aspect here, but we've picked up from one of the lines of inquiry from the peer assessment is how we can do the best possible job with young people who are at risk. And I can promise you at the moment we don't just bundle them onto a train or a bus to send them home. We do our best to try and get them in touch with their family, but there's more to be done in that area.
So last week, 2 children were interviewed. Unfortunately, as a result of delays with the solicitor, those dragged on into the evening. We worked with social care and transported them back ourselves, back from Harrogate custody, back up north, to make sure that there was a safe and secure return to the person with parental responsibility, in agreement with social care. So there's obviously Intelligence Bureau, so that includes Force Intelligence Bureau, which covers off working with other forces, going back to a cross-border issue. They have a responsibility to link in at a force level, and they obviously link in with National Crime Agency, Crime Stoppers, which is really valuable, and I would urge anyone watching to use that if they need to. So, you know, with these county line types issues, that they are linked in, and there are sort of outward-looking eyes to make sure that we're joined up as much as we can be.
Jim, and if there are different models for going about investigations in forces. Some are that's a relatively centralised one, and there are other forces or districts within forces where it might rest with a frontline officer that case all the way through.
Yeah.
Pros and cons to both of those.
Yeah.
We won't go into now. How do you see the balance at the moment? You know, the hubs are not new anymore, but they're not the way we've always managed it in North Yorkshire.
No, there's 3 broad models. I think there's always an opportunity to look at what's best moving forward, because what was right previously may not be right moving forward. What's right now may be correct moving forward. I think the next couple of slides may help you with that answer. This is the current workload when the slides were prepared not so long ago in relation to the number of crimes that each investigation hub has. So, as you would expect, City Hub, which covers Selby district as well, has the most, moving over to Coast and the County Hub. just to put that into some sort of context, you know, if you look at the resourcing above that, you've got 13 crimes per officer in the city hub, about 8 crimes per officer in the coast hub, and 10 in the county hub. So one of the things our investigation procedure does do is it links not just solvability, thrive, but it also is cognizant, and it's written into the procedure, of officers' well-being and welfare, because if the officers are overworked and overloaded, then they're less likely to give the victims and the criminal cases they're looking at a good service. So we have linked in the officers' individual well-being. So when you look at all those crimes that are sat underneath the investigation hubs, they're active, they're under investigation, they're being looked at and pursued along their various main lines of inquiry. But it's not just as simple as that. So we'll get forensic hits weekly. So I'll say to the intelligence detective inspector and the hub inspector and say, right, we've got all these forensic hits. Which one of these are against burglaries, for example? Or which one of these forensic hits are linked to recidivists, people who are repeat offenders in terms of continually committing offences? So not only will they deal reactively with the workload, but we'll also try and proactively look at the forensic opportunities. Again, sat in the investigation hubs, we have burglary coordinators. Going back to the point we've made some moments ago, it's not just the individual burglary that gets looked at, it is holistically looked at. You don't have one burglar doing only one crime. Burglaries are committed by people who commit several.
Jim, how long have those burglary coordinators been in place?
There's been various start-off points. So I think the one at York has been longer than the one in Harrogate. I think it's the one in Harrogate's been just under a year, maybe 6 months. But before the burglary coordinators, there's always been, as part of the operating model, a link between the investigation hub and intelligence, and the forensic hits, because we've never ever really lost sight of the fact that it's important that we look at burglary. It's such a horrible offence that we don't lose sight of the fact that we have to chase the criminal, not just the crime. So I think the burglary coordinator is filling a gap that's been created, and it is improving where we've been. But I'll just give you some...
I think it's a welcome development, so it is a welcome development.
I think just in terms of the York coordinator came in a year last April, so we're about 15-16 months into that, and building on, and that was a temporary measure. That was subject of effectively a benefits assessment around about the end of October, just as I arrived in force, and then that then resulted in the county command picking that up. You'll note, I think, from the slide that whilst not seeking to diminish burglary at all in the coastal command at Scarborough and Ryedale, burglary is less prevalent due to the nature of the type of offending that they see across there. So they don't have a coordinator as such, but they do have strong active management of burglars and burglary as a concept in the local area.
So one of the tests for me to give assurance that we're dealing with burglary robustly is the number of arrests. So the Nexus team have kindly pulled off some figures for me. So financial year to date, so April the 1st to today's date, we've had 227 people principally arrested as opposed to VA, but there are some VAs in there as well, for 504 burglaries. So we are doing our best in terms of getting on top of these burglars. So
how many, Jim, sorry?
So we've got here, we have had 227 individual nominals on niche arrested for and linked to 504 burglaries.
So 2 each, roughly.
Yeah, they will have done a lot more.
And also some of them will have done 10 and some of them will have done...
Yes.
And some of them may not have done it. So,
well said.
well, it's fair investigations. But so we are getting there. But in terms of, we'll look at the charge rates or the national charging rates and the formal, there is a big attrition between reasonable grounds to suspect and getting over that threshold for realistic prospect of a conviction on the basis of beyond all reasonable doubt. So there is quite rightly, it's crimes with very low thresholds, they're arrested with reasonable grounds to suspect, but that gulf to get over that evidential burden is one of the reasons why the charging rate isn't what it should be.
So that's interesting. So that we've been having quite a lot of discussions around that, and as to the reasons for that, and even to the point where people are feeling that now the evidential burden that you have to present almost does the job of the jury for them. In that there's, you know what I mean, feeling quite uncomfortable that the CPS is nailing it down to such an extent that they will only take on something that they think is.
Yeah, I mean,
You know what I mean?
I've looked at the national CPS statistics, and I think they were around 84% conviction rate, which is really, really, really good.
Yeah, but
really, really, really good. But when you look at the criminal court statistics for Q1 for 2019, not only, so we've got an increase in recorded crime, but you've got a drop
exactly
of cases going to court.
Charges, yeah. Yeah.
So we're getting, from an investigation perspective, we're getting more in and less out.
exactly.
Yeah.
And one has to ask why.
Well, I think there's.
And it's not all your. It's not your. It's
No,
not
we're part of
entirely
the
your.
system.
Yeah. I'm not. It's not. It's sorry. I didn't mean that. It's all
Yeah.
down to you. I meant more widely. I have got my criminal just LCJP hat on now.
And even knowing that it might be harder to get cases through to court, your team can't help but build cases. And I hope they do get
Yeah.
to that point.
Yeah.
Yes, you still spend the same time
Yeah.
getting stuff
The-
straight.
A successful investigation establishes the truth, and there are many outcomes, not just a
Yeah.
charge or a caution. And you know, I will say to a lot of my detectives who spend and PCs who spend and staff who spend weeks and months on investigations that you know the old binary outcome of a charge and prison sentence isn't the only outcome.
Yeah.
And you know, if at the end of it we've made someone's life a little bit better, whether it's through diversion, restoration, or some other form of referral, then that, for me, is an outcome.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think that's important in the context of the increasing number of people who come to us with vulnerabilities and need help.
Yeah.
But the help they need isn't necessarily criminal justice help, it
Yeah,
might
yeah.
be social care help, it might
Yeah.
be assistance to move on with their lives. And we pride ourselves on putting the same amount of effort into that as we will at trying to put a burglar into jail or whatever that might be in terms of that offender. Because it has become a much more complex and linked landscape, hasn't it, over time?
So the question is how we communicate that, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one of the things we could be better at is communicating with the communities what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what some of the interim as opposed to final outcomes are. We obviously link in with the Safer Neighbourhood team of corporate comms. I know that we've had previously Twitter accounts where we could put some news out in terms of people being arrested or things being fixed in the broadest sense. I think there's more opportunities for us to get out the good work and give that assurance through online, whether it's through WhatsApp groups. So I think, you know, moving forward, there's always room for improvement, and there's always room to provide more assurance of the work that we're doing. And I think there is something a bit more to it than a community impact assessment and corporate comms on a website. It's got to be a little bit more modern. So I
yeah,
think
but it's
there's-
also quite complex, isn't it? Because actually you are in effect asking to people to sort of move on from the fact that that custody is the only answer, and actually there are a whole range of other answers, and that is quite complicated. So you know, if you put a Twitter message out saying we're delighted somebody's, you know, we've instead of been arrested has had a restorative justice practice, you know, the public might not be quite as reassured about that, but actually the outcome might be better because it might stop the offender offending and the victim get some sense of actually it having been dealt with properly. It's complex.
Yeah, we have to respect confidentiality, we have to respect criminal judicial proceedings, so, but it doesn't mean to say we can't get some message out there that we've dealt with something effectively, if not in what would be considered a traditional outcome way. So I think there are opportunities where we can, you know, say, you know, today we've dealt with, I don't know, 26 people for these offences with appropriate outcomes, with a little bit more detail. So
ask one just I'm just going back a little bit. You might not be able to answer this, Jim. It's quite an unfair question, really. But we are seeing in the news, partly related to consent laws, but not really. There's an accusation that CPS are having a higher and higher threshold for rape and sexual assault cases, and more of those that seemingly, from the victim's point of view, could and should be taken to court aren't being. Do you feel that trend in an investigative sense that it less might be getting through the system, even at that really sort of serious end where there's been, I don't know how much work done?
They have a very difficult job to CPS. Quite rightly, the threshold is really high with those offence types. There have been occasions recently where we've challenged, some successfully, some decisions which we've not liked, and others where we have succeeded in those challenge. I remember one case not so long ago where someone's been convicted and sentenced to prison, and it originally was screened out while the victim consented. So a lot of the officers won't give up in terms of turning over all stones that they can, but likewise the suspects and the offenders need to know that we've done that careful, fair investigation, and that we have not just taken people's words for it. Because again, I keep saying we're there to, and we talk about disclosure later, but the investigation isn't just what the victim says. Typically with these other types, we must very carefully and equally look at what the suspect is saying. And CPS will hold us to account if we've left obvious lines of inquiry.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Just to flag you, because of all our questions with.
I know, I'm watching the time. We've got 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll try and rattle through.
It's our fault. Sorry, there's just one thing on... oh, right, go on.
No,
go on. Keep going. Apologies.
That's okay. So in terms of length of investigations, there's some time scales there, varying degrees of time scales. I think there is an opportunity for some of the county crimes to be done a little bit quicker, but there's a balance between quickly dealing with a crime and giving it the full effort and diligence. And I think there is no correct length of time for an investigation, but I think that the trend there is perhaps in county we're taking a bit longer than in city, but I'd need to look at the reasons for that.
Well, so that's my big question on this. Is I know it'd be really interesting to look at those reasons. I mean, it's if you look at this, it seems to be whenever a PIP 2 crime is involved, the length of time is proportionately much higher than PIP 1 crimes, where the disparity is less, which you might expect because the PIP 2 crimes are the more complex crimes.
Yes.
Yeah. But why that should be the case in county as opposed to city is the question.
Yes, I think that's a fair challenge, and it does need looking at. I think there are some charts further on, which I'll probably flick through fairly quickly, but if you look at the county crimes under investigation, average length of investigations, we are spending a lot of time on drugs investigations, linked to county lines, linked to supply offences, and that will skew the overall length of crime.
It's interesting to strip those out of the data and see what lies behind
Take the outliers
out.
Because if I was, somebody in Craven should have the same speed of justice as somebody in Filey. So, but
it also might tell us something about the way we configure our services, depending upon the sort of challenge of the geography.
Straight on a county lines perspective, possession of weapons you deal with very quickly in county, much quicker than the other places.
Well, yeah, because it's on them. But I think statistics need to be looked at in context. And I think the issue for me is we have a corporate operating model, which is the investigation hubs, which is based around centralised custody. That model does lend itself towards denser populations, with the quite correct use of our VA suites, not everyone has to come into custody. There will be crime held by local officers out at Bentham or up at Richmond or Catterick Garrison, which they will hold locally as opposed to going to the hub, because they can deal with the suspect, victims and witnesses all locally as opposed to a transport in. But I do think there is one of the ways we could improve is looking at those outliers.
So my question, I suppose we are looking at this through other work streams at the moment, and it's to make sure that the data that something like this is throwing up is fed into the other into the other programmes of work, which we've spent quite a lot of time this morning discussing. There is some interesting stuff. So, CCTV, I hate to bang on about CCTV again, but actually we've got better CCTV in Scarborough and York than we do in other areas. And, maybe that is a contributory factor to things not taking us long. I don't know, it's trying to sort of get under the skin of it and understand it.
The ready availability of some of that evidence in the, if you like, the more urban areas lends itself to defendants at the point of interview saying, I did that. Then you get a guilty plea, which means that the file build is much less intensive to get there, whereas often in some of those other uncovered areas it's difficult. So we're reliant on the forensic approaches which elongate the investigation.
But that tells us a lot, doesn't it, around how we should start to think about not necessarily a one-size-fits-all model, which is what we've got at the minute.
I wouldn't expect all commands to have all the same statistics. No. I think there'll always be local variants, but whether you go the OIC model, the prisoner processing and case building model, or the one-stop shop investigation hub model, all are equally valid, all have merits, all have disbenefits, and it's what's right moving forward for the right area. That they all are based on very similar elements. In terms of the City Hub, we've discussed it, so I'll flick through these. This just gives the average length of investigation in terms of days by crime type. You'll see vehicle offences are quite high there, but that was 7 vehicle offences where 5 took over 40 days. These are solvable vehicle offences, so there will have been issues around CCTV, there will have been issues around forensic recovery, footwear, glass and all that sort of stuff. And likewise in the Coast Hub you'll see it seems to take a long amount of time for vehicle offences to be looked at. That was 4 crimes, 1 crime skewed it because it took 147 days. And I suppose the other caveat I would say, these are crimes that are shown live on the system. There's obviously a data lag if an officer completes an investigation for the sergeant getting around to reviewing it and then putting it on. So there are some live investigations which are awaiting to be finalised.
Do you have a view then, Jim? It's kind of what you're talking about, counter taking a bit longer in general, but on one argument is inefficient, the other argument is diligent. Do you know sometimes where are those lie? So vehicle offences, one might imagine, well, it's less serious. That might be lower down the priority list. So all the other things get done first, and it keeps getting pushed on.
Okay, so one of the last instructions I gave was we've got a drugs expert witness statement. So this is where you have an expert trained individual who looks at the evidence in relation to possession with intent to supply. I think when I look at across the piece nationally, I think we're out of kilter in the sense that a lot of other drug offences are taking less time to investigate, so they're dealing with it as possession as opposed to possession with intent to supply. So one of my challenges is, are all these drug expert witness statements needed? Is possession with intent to supply actually a feasible offence? So I think there's a question around, to specifically answer that, yes, I think there's some room there to improve, but we need to be careful that we don't let people get away with possession when they've actually been dealing.
Jim, in terms of the validity of the data, are these figures taken from the closure times when it's administratively closed, or are they taken from the actual time?
I think from the Nexus team I asked that question and they've given me the answer that it's when the sergeant puts the final review on.
Not when it goes to crime recording unit to be finalised.
Yeah, so this
that could take a number of
so no,
days.
It's not that. It's
a sergeant sign off.
Yes.
So they are actual.
Yes.
They're fairly accurate then
Yes.
at the time the investigators physically got it,
yes.
as opposed to it then waiting to be filed from an administrative perspective.
Correct. They've taken that cut off to avoid the other. Yeah.
Okay.
So in terms of challenges, disclosure's key. We sometimes have significant delays which can increase the length of time for investigations to be concluded because of the reasons you're talking around CPS requiring everything to be ready. For third-party unused material, that could be children's social care records, that could be school records. There's issues around redaction and completing of the schedule. Some inquiries amass a very large amount of documentation and other unused evidence which has to be properly scheduled. It's part of the investigation process, but that is something which does take time. Digital examinations, obviously the other issue that's there, without going into too much detail, the amount of data that individual devices can hold can be massive, and it can yield a lot of time to do the review. So we are starting to go down, and I did it last year with an inquiry, where we're starting to do artificial intelligence searches on the yields from devices, so we'll keyword searches, for want of a better phrase, depending on the crime type. So we will start to use software to help us go through the devices, not just manual reviews. Forensics, obviously we've had national issues with Eurofins. I had an email on the 13th of June, all forces to reduce forensic casework submissions with immediate effect was the instruction. And the issue for me on that is, well, if it's a reasonable line of inquiry, we're doing it.
We've also just had that communication from CPS, haven't we, about bail?
22nd of July, CPS direct only for remand, all other cases bail to local CPS areas for charging decision. The issue is we're responsible for the investigations and service delivery to the victim. The thing that we sometimes fail to tell our victims is we are part of a system. We will do everything we can. We will uncover every stone and pursue reasonable lines of inquiry, which is our duty. But there are other national bodies which click in, which impact on the timescales, forensics and CPS being the biggest. And we have to manage those victim expectations, which means keeping the victim contact agreement up to date. It means managing their expectations, not over-promising and under-delivering.
And I think in terms of that discussion around attrition rate, by the time you get to court, it's been long held in terms of research that the longer a case runs on for, the more disengaged the victim becomes. And the minute that the victim and the witnesses turn off, that's the point at which you lose your case. And we could have done the best possible job and they could be really happy with us, but we don't get the outcome that the system would see as a positive.
So continual learning, continual spirit of improvement. With the bail legislation coming in, there's been a reduction of people released on bail and an increase of people released under investigation without the burden of having a date to attend custody. So that has meant that the crime investigation management has slipped a little bit in terms of how long investigations are kept live. So under the criminal justice side, we've got a bail manager to help make sure we keep our investigations timely and people aren't left in limbo, if I'm honest with you.
Well, it's the unintended consequences of the legislation trying to solve exactly the same problem that it's created.
But even before the bail manager, we did have a process in place whereby we would have the sergeants from custody link in with the sergeants on the same band from the investigation hub and go through, right, who are shown as out on IUI. It's just a little bit harder to manage because there's no date to aim for. But it's important that, you know, if you are released under suspicion, under investigation, actually there is an outcome for that person.
And we've contributed to there's a national piece of review work ongoing around released under investigation, which we've contributed some views to through Leanne McConnell in the last couple of weeks. And Leanne's commissioned, sort of on our behalf, some internal work as to how better we can manage those who are released under investigation. And that should report in the next few weeks. We'll make sure that that's shared across.
And then the final one is the offender profile. So we're recognising the vulnerability of some of the people engaged in criminal activity, which we've discussed before, but effectively there can be a victim and a perpetrator at the same time. So opportunities, detective recruitment pathways. So nationally there's been a shortage of detectives. The investigation hubs are proving a lucrative recruiting sergeant for people to be exposed to solvable crime investigations, and so we are having people moving from PC on response to PC in the hub to doing the CID exam, passing the CID exam and starting their detective training pathway in the CID, which is really welcome. I think there's more to do. We're not really the best at selling ourselves. But the work that Dave and Steve have done in relation to that has meant that we're starting to fill our gaps. The proactive teams or the expedite teams, I've talked around their success criteria not just being binary, but this is an opportunity for us to get back on the front foot. So this is where we can send officers out, start engaging in a caring but robust way as and when needed to deny these travelling criminals our patch, so that they don't feel comfortable crossing the border and coming on to us. Cyber capability, I think we've got an amazing DFU. Some of the work and product that we're getting out of them, particularly on the bespoke cases, is absolutely first class. And you know, there's commendations going out for some of the technicians in that department, but we are really very lucky in terms of what we've got there. Service effort, working with Nexus to work out, you know, hidden demand and future demand in terms of all the unseen work. So I have my own case workload. It's typically death workload, where the investigation is, has a crime taken place? That features as one instant, but there's a lot of work behind it, which we use people for. And then partnership working with trading standards and schools, social care. I think there's plenty of opportunity to work not in isolation. A lot of the work I've had to do recently locally has been, let's engage with the school in the first instance, let's get the head teacher on board, let's share the problem and see what they can bring to help us work with them, not to them. And likewise, I've got an investigation which I've retained primacy for, but I've allocated and delegated a substantial amount of work to trading standards because they're the experts, which has freed up some detective capacity to deal with crime that trading standards can't deal with. So I think there's more opportunities to work collaboratively.
On that note, Jim, when I was last with Trading Standards, who I agree are brilliant in North Yorkshire in particular, there was an agreement to share some detective capacity. I don't know if it was staff or officers, I can't remember now, which was struggling to be fulfilled because of the challenges around sourcing your own detectives, your own work. But do you know if that's resolved?
I think the commitment to supply a detective is still there, and at the end of the day, they're still doing police work, they're still picking up on the vulnerability issue, they're still picking up on...
They're in trading standards.
Let me come back to I spoke with Steve Thomas around that because it was more of a headquarters crime-based initiative as opposed to one necessarily for county. I'll find out that the last I'd spoken with Steve is that was put back in place, but I can check and come back outside the meeting.
It has been in place, it wasn't, and I think it's going back in, but the boss is right, we'll give you the detail outside of the meeting. And then I think the final slide is managing investigations. So obviously we want quality, timely, fair investigations by accredited individuals who are unable to do their own workload whilst overseen and supported. So, you know, going down to victim focus and care, I think we're starting to realise that it's not just the individual victim, it's communities as well that we need to be looking at. So it's that linking traditional crime investigation with the local safer neighbourhood teams, whether that be the sergeants or the PCSOs. So I think there's opportunities there to look more at location.
It's really good when that happens. I mean, I hate to go back to my local example, but the PCSO then did house to house after that, and that was very helpful for quite an anxious community. You know, it was a really good thing to have done, and it worked well.
So, and then obviously accurate crime recording. There's two elements to it. We obviously want to chase the crime, which is compliance, making sure we record it correctly in time, but there's obviously chasing the criminal aspect of that as well. But we can't do any of it if our data is out of date and inaccurate, because in order to manage the piece, to see where we're making a difference, we need to understand as quickly as possible what's happening. So that's about understanding the data in quick time so we can respond. I've talked around public satisfaction previously, around perhaps engaging in a more online and proactive way with all the caveats that have been mentioned, and then sharing some more of the successes. So there's a slide which we can look at in slow time perhaps later, but there are some of the successes that we have in terms of, in fact it's not on there, I'll put it up later, but there's some amazing investigation work going on. You know, there are some occasions where we could do better, definitely, where we've perhaps not done as well as we could, but I'm reassured and humbled a lot of the time of the quality of the investigations that go in, the hard work and effort, there is always room for improvement, but there are some outstanding pieces of work going out there, and one of my issues is I perhaps don't celebrate it as much as I should.
Well, thank you, Jim. We shall celebrate your successes here today. Thank you very much. And thank you to your teams. I know they are stretched and do all the right things for the right reasons, so thank you.
No, thank you.
Right. Will's gone. Okay, so he needs nothing to say on that now. Thank you. Dave, are you going to start? Yeah, if that's all right.
Yeah, happens, yeah. So we've been asked to give you a short presentation on how North Yorkshire Fire Rescue Service delivers our business fire safety to obviously the non-domestic customers in the county. I'm going to touch on that. We're also going to address some of the other questions that you've asked us around how we make sure we've got competent staff or trained staff, and how we sort of manage or balance the risk of where we want to put our resources, why do we go to certain types of businesses. I'll try and explain that to you as we go through. And I will pick up on that question around, in particular Grenfell, around some of the lessons that we've learned, not just with regards to business fire safety, but also some of the wider lessons that have been learned by ourselves. This slide up here is really a hierarchy of the activity that we carry out in what we call business fire safety. And it's drawn like that for a number of reasons. One, it indicates the volume of work, or the amount of activity that is spent on those particular types. It also signifies level of complexity, and it also looks at possibly the level of severity as well. So at the bottom we've got audits, which is where we actually go out and we work with businesses, or we meet businesses and carry out a meeting with them where we look at how they are meeting the needs of the fire safety order, the piece of legislation that all businesses have to comply with. And our staff will make an assessment of that building, of the level of compliance. I'll come a little bit later on to about why that's important, but we use a standard nationalised toolkit for doing that, so that what we do in North Yorkshire is consistent in our county and around the country.
Dave, these numbers are interesting, but they're hard to put in context.
Okay, so the numbers are really an indication. These are our home office returns from last year, and they indicate the volume of work done. So at the bottom, we carried out 1,161.
No, I understand that, but say in comparison to a similar service, how would you compare?
Probably quite well. I can't give an exact answer how we compare to another one, but the amount of audit activity there, I think, is representative of quite a high level of activity based on the amount of people we've got. So if you compared us with a larger service with more staff, they might carry out more. But interestingly, in North Yorkshire, our whole times crews carry out fire safety audits, whereas in other neighbouring regional fire rescue services, they currently don't.
Okay, so
our activity
that could be quite significant
high,
then, right?
Based on the resources we've got available to us.
Okay. And so if you got that triangle then, so obviously an audit leads to an advice leads to...
No, they're separate things.
Okay,
I'll explain
right,
to you
all right.
as we go through it.
Yeah.
Okay? So audit is a standalone piece of work, an activity where we go in, it's scheduled, we arrange to meet the business owner or a representative of, go in and carry out an audit. So we're looking at about 12 to 15 articles or areas of interest to it. So that'll be things like, have they carried out a risk assessment? Have they got arrangements for making the means of escape secure? Have they got a way or a means for detecting and alerting people that there's a fire, so a fire alarm system? And we make an assessment on whether that's broadly compliant with what the fire safety order requires, or there's an area of non-compliance, or it's quite a serious deficiency from that, and we'd say that's a minor or a major deficiency. And the toolkit that we use basically calculates, using an algorithm, an overall level of compliance with the order. So the audits are quite standalone pieces of work that we carry out.
Okay, so you get a very large number of false alarms.
Mm-hmm.
How do you link the audit work that you do with those premises that have regular...
Yeah, so we have a policy in service called managing unwanted fire signals.
Yeah.
And written into the policy, we have a threshold. So if any business has either 2 activations in any one calendar month, or one rolling month, or 6 activations in a 12-month period, that triggers a piece of work carried out by a fire safety specialist. So we would normally allocate that to one of our specialist staff, and they would work through with the businesses ways to reduce the volume of unwanted fire signals.
Because the return on investment from that type of activity could be quite high, given the number of call-outs that you get.
Yeah. And it's important to understand that certain buildings have large numbers of smoke detectors. And the issue we've got is that the fire alarm system is designed to tell people in the building that there may be a problem. Where we find we have our issue is that some of those systems are linked into what they call an auto dialer, so it automatically calls out the fire service.
So, because I mean, we used to have a burglar alarm that was hooked up, quote unquote, to the police, but actually it's a security company that they go through. And then if you get a certain number of false alarms, then you're disconnected. So it does actually make you very cognizant of maintaining your system and all of the rest of it, because you really don't want that third striking you out. And has anybody ever done anything like that in the fire service?
Well, we have had certain businesses or certain organisations that have had very high numbers of calls to the fire service where we responded, and those thresholds have very easily been met. So we've done some work with them. So we've had things like, we give you an extra couple of minutes to go and check whether or not it's a real fire or not before, or we will mobilise. So there can be some checks and balances put into it. We've changed our mobilising to certain types of premises or certain types of occupiers at certain times.
Yeah, I was to say there are examples of services that have introduced policies where the owners of the properties which create large numbers of unwanted signals are charged for each fire and rescue service response. It's difficult insofar as often the bureaucracy of administering that charge means that it's not really good value for the fire and rescue service necessarily. But also many of those buildings are public buildings, so it's hospitals and schools and universities, places that have got huge sites with lots of separate buildings, and as Dave said, lots of smoke detection. And what we would end up with is a fire and rescue service charging other public bodies, which are funded by taxpayer money, exactly that. And it's also tricky, of course, to discriminate between private business and public sector actual properties. So it's not beyond the bounds of reason that we could charge for very high, what's the word I'm looking for?
Offenders.
Very high rates of offenders, and we would be willing to do that if we felt that the occupier wasn't doing anything reasonable to try to minimise the number of false activations. But what we also need to do is we need to make sure that people take it seriously and that they maintain their systems, which are there for a reason. So we want to be informed if there's a likelihood that there's a fire. In amongst that, there is the danger that you get those false alarms. So it's always a balance between deciding who and how we might charge for repeat offences and working with a business that is willing to invest in its system to try to reduce those number of calls.
It's just, I mean, if you go through the incident logs, summaries on a daily basis, it's always at least half, if not more. I mean, it is a very significant number of calls.
And some of the calls, of course, do lead to fires. We had one in Harrogate last week where it was actually a fire, so it serves the purpose. And so to say that we're not going to go to certain premises types is a tricky one as well. So we have, as Dave said, we've done a great deal of work with a lot of the staff on site at these places to reduce them. There's still always work we can do. Automatic fire alarms can be activated through cooking as well. So sometimes on the summary you'll see good intent where that was cooking, the actual alarm's done the what it should do, but actually it was cooking. So that's when we can go and do safe and well visits and other things to try and combat the effects of those types of alarms. But as Andrew said, it is very, very tricky trying to balance the two.
It's difficult though, isn't it? I mean, I don't mean to sound facetious, but when somebody burns the toast and sets off the fire alarm, which I happen to do on a regular basis in my own house, fortunately I'm not hooked up to the fire and rescue service, you know, it's a very expensive resource to deploy, isn't it?
And those types of premises where that does happen tends to be in care or care facilities where it's sheltered housing, so it is a vulnerable style of person that lives there, so it's only right that we do respond accordingly, but then we need to work locally with them to do all we can to prevent that happening.
That's a prime example, because what we would look to do with a sensible owner of a care home, for example, is if it's smoke detection which is regularly being set off by somebody overcooking something, to consider whether or not smoke detection is most appropriate or whether heat detection would be a more appropriate system in there. And that's where the experts within the technical fire safety team will work with the building owners to try to get them to invest in that change to make it less likely that it will be a false activation or an unnecessary activation. But you're right, it's a huge problem across the country, and it's always striking a balance between making sure that we do get early warning of a fire, because of course that reduces the overall amount of resource if that turns into a much more significant fire, and the safety of the firefighters would have to be tackling it. So we'll always try to strike the balance, and when we do find people who aren't maintaining their systems properly, aren't willing to work with us, well, that's when we will be looking to do more significant audits and potentially even go toward enforcement activity.
Yeah.
What's the faults on systems?
There are.
Yeah.
There are. They're very complex systems, and they're quite. Some systems are specifically designed to give extremely early warning of a fire, because the value of what's in there, either in financial value or intelligence value, is so great that you just can't be taking too much risk with allowing a fire to develop in there if it does start.
Particularly at this time of year when harvest starts, the small bugs can actually go into the bits and they can set them off as well, so that can pose a problem. Many different ways that they will activate.
However, you're right, it's a concern of course that we go to that many activations, and we'll continue to work
I mean, this would
try to
seem the
minimise them.
sort of route through it, wouldn't it?
And the other difficult, of course, is when we're responding to those types of incidents, is taking crews away from the prevention and protection work that they could otherwise be doing. So it isn't, and it increases the road risk and all the rest of it, so it is something that's taken seriously.
Do we have any idea, Andrew, Dave, whether the proportion of false alarms in North Yorkshire that you're happy to respond to is any different to others, proportionately? So we're a small
I would say it's actually very comparable. I think a lot of services have gone down the road of bringing an unwanted fire signals policy, and there's actually a national piece of work which has just been launched at the moment, which we're looking to get involved with as well, to look at how we drive this down. So it is a very well recognised national problem. It's not something that we're just dealing with in lone isolation. I think that the activities that we've done in the last few years have been really quite important, significant, and just to close this one down, I think we have made really good steps, and some of those people or businesses that we did used to go to an awful lot have significantly dropped the number of calls that we attend as a result of those interventions. So it is good work that's being done, but we haven't finished it yet. So just going through this very quickly, advice, this is where we get a lot of requests in from business owners. They want from some relatively simple queries and questions that they've got to ask us, right through some more detailed concerns they've got about their level of fire safety. And of course we're obligated and we'll always want to provide good quality advice to businesses, but we fall short of, or we stop short of, acting as a consultant. So it's the responsibility of the business to make sure that they are compliant with the legislation. And if they get to a point where they're now getting above their level of expertise, it will be expected that they go out and source somebody else who is. We're not there to do it from. Our role is as a regulator, stroke enforcer, but we will provide advice to businesses to a level we think is appropriate and proportionate. Working with others, this is moving on now. We are a statutory consultee to other regulators, so in particular building controls, or approved inspectors as they're called, the private sector, and licensing authorities. And in our county we get planning applications in from the national parks as well. So we get quite a lot of consultations that come in, and again we're expected to return those consultations and turn around within a set period. So there's quite a bit of work that goes on with those other organisations. Moving on, the reason why it's kind of in the middle, it's important because that's at the design and build stage. So this is where buildings are basically being created from a plan and being built, or significant refurbish. So that's the opportunity for fire services to check plans, and we can make comments about the level of compliance when they become occupied with the fire safety order. Equally, we can make comments back about licensing, or quite often a licensing consultation that triggers an audit. That's kind of how that normally works. Now we're moving into the top two tiers. Complaints can range from something really quite minor right through to a very, very significant complaint. We have an internal procedure for deploying specialist staff to go and do the complaint, and we do sort of like take a risk-based approach to it. So if we get something that's basically saying this is looking like it's really serious, we would deploy somebody from our flexi-duty cadre immediately. So ideally they'd be within an hour, and they would make the initial intervention, and then they can speak to a specialist or they can speak to somebody else and work what's the right method of dealing with that. Sometimes those complaints lead to the very top tier, which is around enforcement activity, so I'll come to that in a second. But also they can lead to other types of work. So it might be that it scales down to just some good advice, or it might lead to an audit, or it might be that we pass it on to another organisation, so we share the information with somebody else, like for example environmental health or licensing. So at the top of the tree we've got enforcement activity. Enforcement activity for us really is either generated through the process of audit. So enforcement notices are an outcome where we've assessed the level of compliance to the fire safety order, and we feel they've fallen considerably short, or we've calculated they've fallen to a level of compliance which is below what we expect. We have the opportunity to serve the notice and say this is what you need to do. Not in a prescriptive format telling them how to do it. We flag up the broad article areas that they need to remedy. We can talk them through a range of options, but we can also point them to national guidance as well. The thing about the enforcement notice is it's time framed, and whilst the person who served it has the right of appeal, if they fail to comply with an enforcement notice, it is actually an offence in its own right under the fire safety order. So failing to comply with that could lead to a prosecution.
But presumably any insurance would be null and void or anything like that?
All those sorts of things come about, yeah. But in terms of our role, the notice is to say this is what you need to do, by when, and if you fail to do it, or we might extend it, but if you ultimately fail to do it, it's a recognised offence in its own right. Prohibition notices are slightly different in that they don't require an audit to have taken place. There is a threshold that we would look to see if they have met, but in effect what it's saying is a person or persons at serious risk of injury or death in the event of a fire. And we look for a number of factors. Could a fire start, could the person knock it out, and could the fire spread? And we have an internal process where that is checked by fire safety specialists, and then the application for the serving of a prohibition notice is then tested by a senior manager or officer, and if that is agreed, then the notice is served, and that can either prohibit the use of the building or it can restrict an activity within the building. So they are really quite weighty notices to serve. We don't serve them lightly, but we do serve them when they meet that threshold.
What sort of thing?
If you went to a care home or a hotel and there was no fire alarm system, or there was no facility for raising the alarm, then we might say, well, you can't sleep in here. Or if we went to a nightclub, this happened recently, where there are too many people in the nightclub.
On duty?
Yeah. No, I wasn't. No, yes. basically too many people in the nightclub, so we would say, no, we're going to put a restriction notice on it, saying that you can only have, let's say, 500 people in the building. So we would put that in place. Okay?
Would you then go monitor that?
Yes. Yes, so the point is that a prohibition notice, it's the same language that I've just cited as what constitutes an offence in the fire safety order, which is really quite significant because it is one of the triggers that, following on what you've just been saying about why we would then investigate a possible offence. So if we serve them on, that automatically then launches what's called a fire safety investigation, and that's where we gather all the evidence together. And then that evidence is subject to a test, which is a panel of senior officers who would then do evidential and public interest tests. And at that stage we decide then to do the third one, which is a prosecution. So if it is agreed that there is a weight of evidence that says we believe an offence has been committed and it's in the public interest to do so, then the fire service will continue that into the courts to prosecute.
So like a nightclub, just sort of ignoring or assessing out with a busy game or just letting in? Like
So we had a perfect example of that in York recently where exactly that did happen. There was an overcrowding issue and it was reported to us after the event, but CCTV enabled us to count how many people were in there, and that was followed the exact process that Dave's just mentioned there. We had an internal public interest test. Should we take it to prosecution? We did, and there was over £110,000 worth of fines awarded.
And was that a member of the public going just it felt too busy in there?
There was a number of different complaints in there, and it was because of the overcrowding issue that night.
Yeah.
What agency do you use to prosecute?
So we use a solicitor who's North Yorkshire Council solicitor currently, and then she has right of audience in the Magistrates Court. If it goes to Crown Court, then we use chambers from London called Red Line Chambers. So there's a chap called Sage Mehta who's been a barrister that's represented us on several cases successfully. So we've used him. So this slide really is just taking a look at the areas that we think we are quite strong at, or we've been fed back that we are quite strong at. The risk-based inspection programme, this is the kind of mechanism that we have within the service to decide where we're actually going to direct our resources to go and audit. So some of the work at the top end of that pyramid is obviously, we don't really control it. We don't know where the complaint's going to come from, for example. We don't actually know where the consultations are going to come from. We know the organisations, but we don't know which buildings are going to be built. But when it comes to directing resources to go and do audit activity, this is where we use a risk-based inspection programme to direct our staff and resources. And this can come from a few places, or we can use information from a few places, and I'll go a bit longer further on to explain. I think it's an area that we really want to develop further. You know, we want to be much more intelligence-led with this, but the risk-based inspection, we understand why certain buildings present certain types of risks to us. So an easy way of describing it to you is those places where people sleep, so care, large hotels, hospitals, inevitably provide us with more significant levels of risk if they catch fire than maybe a shop or an office does. Okay. It's not just this is not risk to firefighting staff. This is risk to the occupants if it happens. So those people in care homes, maybe or hospitals, are semi or non-ambulant. They require assistance to move, and those features inside the building and the arrangements to make that happen need to be really quite robust. Okay, so that's an example of why we would focus on those sorts of premises. But we are a regulator, and as part of that, we need to make sure that we sample across all business types. Okay, and interesting, when we look at our prosecution cases that we've taken, we have taken relatively small buildings to court successfully. You know, shops and small license premises, for example, because they just didn't comply with the legislation. So you can't just correlate large buildings with the biggest risk. It's about sampling and compliance. Trained qualified workforce, I'll touch on this a little bit later on, but we do have now a very high level of training provided to all our operational staff, both in the operational roles on fire stations and in the dedicated fire safety teams. The third point is important because it's, as far as businesses go, and I'll mention called the BRD in a second, they expect us to work with them in a very consistent manner. So if you have a business in Leicester, you would expect the same level of audit activity to happen in Harrogate. Okay, it shouldn't be dissimilar, it should be exactly the same. So we train to a particular standard, but we use a nationally agreed process of auditing, and that's really important for fairness, consistency and all those sorts of things. And the last one, we do have very established, tried and tested relationships with local authorities, in particular building controls. We've worked with them for many, many years. The idea of consulting with them is something we've been doing under their regulations, but some of our staff have been in fire safety for quite a long time, and they have a very sort of like close personal working relationship with them, and whilst we're in separate organisations, we treat them almost like pseudo colleagues, because we can pick the phone and talk to them very, very quickly and easily, and quite often that's an easy way of just moving things along and expedite a process that could potentially take a lot of time if it was done by lots of written reports and things. I've just mentioned the BRDO. BRDO stands for the Better Regulatory Delivery Office, and it's the way that the government wants those regulators to operate. And basically this is lifted from what we call a competency framework, but these 6 areas here are what we are striving to make sure we have in place to ensure that we deliver our regulatory function as well as we possibly can do. So at the top we've got organisational effectiveness. This is making sure that we have all the right systems, the right models in place to make, and the tools to be able to deliver our fire safety with businesses. The technical element is really around the technical knowledge that people need to have. This is technical stuff. You've got to know what you're looking for, you know where to go to relevant guides, to be able to reference or source information from. Adequate communication systems, so how do we make sure that we communicate outwardly from the service to the businesses? The vast majority of our communication now is electronic. Not all, there are some businesses that still don't. Well over 95% of it, I would suggest, is done by email and electronic communication, but also using more modern things, social media, right through to our website and things. Service delivery, I've already mentioned that we have a specialist team of fire safety staff, but we also have work being undertaken by our operational crews, certainly our whole-time operational crews, and our service delivery managers, the people out on districts. They're responsible for making sure that the work or the work that's set for them, the targets are met, and they know where they need to go, why they're going there, and they have adequate information, resources, tools to go and do the fire safety work on behalf of North Yorkshire Fire. The other two, interpersonal skills, well, these are very much part of how we develop people generically within the fire service. We're looking at the ways that people engage with businesses, how they communicate with businesses, how they interact and operate with them. So developing their interpersonal skills, and a lot of that's woven into the sort of leadership and managerial development that our staff get. But the personal style element at the top is more related to, a lot of the work, certainly specialists do, it's quite independent, autonomous. They need to have the confidence to make decisions. They need to be quite tenacious and actually sort of persevere. They need to be an eye for detail. So that's where those two things sort of vary slightly.
Can I just ask, so that's the framework that is a national framework.
Yeah.
How do you measure your performance against that national framework then?
Well, that's a competency framework, and I'm just going to this, which is the next slide, which is basically looking at how that is put together in terms of training.
Okay, but that doesn't measure the outcome.
Sorry, yeah.
So you're telling me what it is and how you do it, but
Yeah.
what we're not getting is the impact of that.
Okay. So
if those are the core competencies, how do you understand whether or not you've got those, assess whether those core competencies are adequate and are effective?
So with the technical one there at the top, this is all really about the training.
Yeah.
So in order to be able to go out and work with businesses, if you flick it around, businesses expect that the fire service will have trained, competent, qualified staff to go and make an assessment of their building. Now, we've now got a large number of nearly all of our operational staff are trained and qualified to do that. And the work that we ask them to go and do is commensurate with that level of training. So that those crews at the top there can go out and audit simple buildings. That's in effect what they're trained to go and do. The next level down is where we've got people who work in the fire safety department, and they will go out and audit complex buildings. And the bottom one is where you've got people who are trained to do all of the above, but also
So
carry out
how do you know
enforcement.
what impact all of this is having then? Because that's the difficult thing to measure, isn't
So-
it? It is the perennially difficult
Yeah,
thing
it
to
is.
measure.
So one of the things we would look for, when we carry out a fire safety audit, it generates an automatic level of compliance. And it's a bit of a hierarchy, broadly compliant right through to enforcement activity and fast track to prosecution. And we know how many different types of audit outcomes we get. So well, that slide I showed you earlier on, which gave the one about enforcement, out of those 1161, 21 of them have led to an enforcement notice. So a very small proportion have led to the highest level of enforcement activity.
Okay, so you've got a lot of people, more than any other fire service, or a lot of fire service, who are trained to do this work. I'm trying to understand the impact
So-
that actually has.
So on the national statistics, which
Yeah.
we submitted as part of the HMIC,
Yeah,
we are in the top 10. I'm going to say we were in the top 5, but that's probably adjusted now. In terms of fire safety outputs, so that's a
Okay.
demonstration that we're punching right above there. We've got 100% track record on prosecutions that we've
Yeah.
taken, and we are producing more prosecutions in North Yorkshire than the national average. So those are the types of things which
Yeah.
suggest regionally. Dave mentioned earlier about the ability for call-outs to complaints. Regionally, we are one of the only services that have got the ability, using our flexi-duty officers, to be able to respond and undertake fire safety work out of hours. And regionally, they're now looking towards us to see if we could supply that for them. So they're the sort of measures I would suggest that which looks towards that concept.
One of the things we've also talked about is being able potentially to be able to assess whether buildings that have had fires in them,
Yeah.
whether they received a visit in the last 3 months, 6 months, year, and being able to take that as a measure as to the quality of the visits and whether there's been sufficient
You
impact
sort of-
from
yeah.
That's a good point, and I think we do have some measures internally where response to complaints, for example, so quite high up in the hierarchy, how many complaints do we, how quickly did we go back to the complaint, and what was the subsequent level of activity that followed from the complaint?
So I suppose what I'm trying to get at is there's quite a lot of resources put into this. It's trying to understand the impact that resource is having on lowering the risk, which is in effect what you're trying to do. And I'm thinking, therefore, how does that feed into, for example, the IRMP when we're looking at
Yeah.
that risk assessment? You see what I mean?
I will come to that in a couple of
Yeah.
slides in June, because
Right,
that
okay.
is something we
Right,
have picked
okay.
up on, and it's, I know what you're asking about. Lessons learned, and this I hope will answer the question you asked at the outset to do with Grenfell. Occasionally, very tragic fires do happen, Grenfell being an example of one back in June 2017. As a fire service, we take quite a mature approach to looking for the learning, listening to the learning that is shared by those services that have had that experience. And the top one was a care home in Strathclyde a few years back, Rose Park. We did a lot of work following that, where we went out and got some upskilling, new training around, in particular, the evacuation strategy in care homes. But Grenfell itself has led to some learning that's been shared by London Fire Brigade, and I think it's fair to say there will inevitably be more learning that comes out of it. If I break it down to sort of a couple of areas really, incident, I know we're talking about fire safety right now, but from an incident command point of view, there were some issues that were raised very early on about how that particular incident was commanded or managed by incident commanders. And over the last 2 years, we've woven some of that learning into our incident command training for certainly flexi duty officers, but it's also included within our safety command and L1 courses. So right through the command structure, people are aware of some of the issues that were raised and the learning taken from it. So how you communicate effectively on fire grounds, how we work across organisations, so the JESIC principles and working the interoperability across emergency response services, the use of airwaves, so not our fireground radios, but our portable main scheme radios has been tested in scenario-based activities. So we've used a lot of that to bring into place with Incident Command. Later in the year, we've got some more exercises which are about how do we search and record that we've adequately searched large complex buildings. So how do we record that we've sent people on various floors or into different parts of a building? We can assure ourselves that that building has been completely searched. We are also looking at what's called fire survival guidance. So when people make phone calls to the fire service, they can be making a call from a trapped position. And our control staff are obviously taking that call, and they've got to give very good quality and accurate advice to the person as to what to do. And we're looking at what we say, what we do, how we say those sorts of things. So that's an ongoing piece of work. Firefighting in high-rise buildings. I mean, we were sort of talking prior to this meeting started, but we don't have a lot of high-rise buildings in North Yorkshire.
Can you just put that in context to other areas then, because I think that's quite important for people to understand.
So the sort of definition of a high-rise building is, and I've got it there, the Hackett Review talks about 10 stories or 18 metres. Okay? So these are buildings that are, we've got about 7 or 8 in the county of North Yorkshire and City of York. We have very low numbers. If you went into the centre of Leeds, you're going to see, you know, a lot. A skyline full, you know. So we have a very, very... Now, some of the issues and the scope in the Hackett Review is, this is where we're talking about, do we extend some of the learning from that into other buildings that don't meet that height criteria? And that's a sensible way of looking at it, because actually we have got some buildings that are of a substantial height, albeit not high-rise in the traditional sense. So we've taken the approach that we've defined our sort of level of, not high-rise, but where we want to have some additional understanding or awareness of around, you know, 6 floors and above. Even that we've only got just over 100, 120 something.
Well, you can pretty much get around all of them then, I would imagine.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what we've asked people to do on a district level is to identify where those buildings are, and we have an opportunity under another piece of legislation to go and gather some risk information about the building for our benefit when we go and attend that building on fire. It's called a 72D, or site-specific risk information. So we can go in the building and we can get the information, then we can use it operationally, or even we can go and visit it and have a look around it, familiarise ourselves with it.
What we need to be careful of as well is that just by virtue of being tall doesn't necessarily make a building more dangerous. So yeah, there are only 120 we can get all around them. If we find a building that's really compliant with fantastic fire safety measures and well managed by the owners, we're not going to put lots of effort into that, because there's greater risk in some lower buildings by virtue of the fact that they haven't got any of those things in. So being high rise is only one factor that we'd consider in deciding how risky a building is.
So I'm just conscious of time. So in effect then, you're taking the learning from Grenfell and applying them to our local context here.
That's right.
And adjusting your risk assessments accordingly.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So in Scarborough, in York, but particularly on the coast, there are a number of old hotels which are now converted into flats, and they're the types of property where you know, housing in multiple occupancy, when they're being converted, they're our risk, which we need to be very aware of.
Well, on that, can I just ask a quick question? So one of the main things that the NFCC is promoting is that services should encourage people living in houses of multiple occupancy, flats, high-rise buildings, to request a safe and well check, because you can only go into the common areas. Are you actively promoting that kind of service to those people? How are you balancing the use of...
I'll come to that in a couple of slides time, Tom, if I can.
All right.
Fantastic.
All right. Can we...
Very quickly.
Yeah.
All
right.
Some of the things that we are seeing as a challenge or an opportunity to improve. We do want to make better use of information intelligence, what we own ourselves, or what we've got in our own systems, but also what we get from other people, other organisations, and use that to more effectively target our resources. A better understanding of the increase in non-domestic fires. So why are fires perhaps, why do we see an increase in maybe fires in commercial buildings, and what support can we give to those buildings as a result of the fire that's happened in terms of business recovery, things like that. And obviously to expand the business engagement toolkit, how do we actually engage with buildings or business owners to give good advice about lessons learned that we've had. So the example John gave about the nightclub, for example, that wants to go to licensing authorities to help them understand what some of the issues were.
Do you understand how helpful businesses find that information?
Yeah,
that you give?
we've always run business engagement work. I think this is about sort of diversifying, looking to do things in a little different way, or maybe targeted to particular groups. We've followed up, serious fires. One at the fatal fire at a large hotel in Harrogate a few years ago now. We did some work with the large hoteliers who provide sleeping accommodation about the issues of that type, and some of them stopped doing it, some of them went and did a lot of remedial work to improve the conditions of that accommodation. We also did it with the insurers. Back to your question, Julie, we went back and did a full presentation with the insurers, and they were really interested because obviously this is the sort of thing that can actually, make an insurance policy null and void.
Yeah, exactly.
And just sorry to follow that up, you as part of your protection strategy, you have undertaken you undertake a satisfaction survey every year. Is that proving the fact that...
That's one of the things I think we would like to improve, and I know we've spoken about trying to do that independently, so I think we do have a facility for going back and asking what the interaction with the fire service was like. We don't get a lot of responses back. It's on our website and things. I think we need to be a little bit more proactive in going out and seeking that feedback, and maybe look at, is it right for us to ask the question, or should we look at somebody else to ask it on our behalf? Tommy, you just asked me a question about the link between our protection and prevention services. This is our community safety and business safety. Absolutely, we want to make sure it's more integrated, and I think by doing so that should feed into what we're talking about, our resource response model. Yep. So how we can use that approach to mitigate risk and drive it down. So don't just look at buildings in isolation from a fire safety point of view, look at the occupiers as well, particularly if you talk about HMOs and flats and social housing. So try to look at what's the best approach and join it up, so that we're going in once and trying to do the more complete, more holistic approach to that work. Working closely with partners such as consultations. There are outcomes of national review. What the Hackett Review is actually advocating is we get consulted at planning stage. So currently we only get it from the national parks, but if we're aware of things that might be coming down, larger developments, then we get the opportunity to talk about facilities, particularly for firefighting. That's where you talk about access for fire engines and hydrants and water supplies, etc. Smart use of information intelligence, and again look at how we can properly optimise opportunities with business owners. And some industries are diversifying. Farming is a really good example. A lot of farmers now are diversifying into other things, so they're providing shops and sleeping accommodation and things. So working with the NFU to talk to them about how we can perhaps support new startup or diversifying businesses in that business engagement approach. This is what we're aiming to do, what we're wanting to look like going forward. So we want to maintain what we believe is a high quality regulation of business safety across the county. We have a business safety plan which we want to implement and launch. The review of audit outcomes which you've talked about, we want to make sure we do it properly. and we've got a final slide which basically what it will look like. That's what we're aspiring to do.
Great.
I was really interested in that about you asking, Commissioner, about how effective our work is here. And it comes back to what I keep talking about, is the minimal amount of evaluation that we do that really allows us to direct our resources to where we know it has the greatest effect. So here we know how much it costs us to run our fire safety, so the economy bit is known. We know how much work we do, the numbers, the activity, the productivity is known. We have some idea of the impact of that work, but as we go over the next IRMP period in particular, that's when I really want us to be getting much better information about how effective that work is and the difference it makes, and the difference it makes therefore to the safety of the people in North Yorkshire and York. I do think in most aspects of most fire and rescue services work, it's that evaluation that we haven't got quite right at the moment, and we need to do more work and put more effort in, so that we know the types of premise that we can go and do fire safety work in where it is the greatest effect. And we do that through the risk-based inspection programme. So we target those buildings which are most likely to result in a fire death or an injury. We can be better at determining how well we do that.
Yeah, because that will help you mitigate risk, which is what the RMP
is all about.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's one of the tools that we've got. Fire protection is one of the tools we've got, alongside prevention, response and resilience.
Thank you. Right, I'm looking at time. I'm going to give you each 15 minutes of performance. Is that all right? I think that's better than most.
Yes.
I'm going to do the performance slides this month to give Annette a softer landing for August. And I'll just take us through the highlights. Hopefully I've been able to give John at least 5 of those 15 minutes back.
Thank you.
So we'll just wait for the slide back. Hopefully will it go, we'll scroll down, will it? To the continue this way. Get it? Okay. So straight in at slide 3 of the pack, around mental health. Not a huge amount to talk about in relation to mental health incidents. Of the detention we did have, that was somebody identified in custody and taken to a place of safety. So that's sort of continues to be good news that we're identifying people at an early stage if they're in custody for criminal matters. As ever, those mental health events do take a long time to be dealt with compared to events not involving a mental health element. Interestingly, we didn't take any of our detainees out of the county this month. I'm not sure whether that's good or bad, but it's just an accident of the calendar, no doubt. York is picking up lots and lots of visits, as you can see, and it'll be interesting to see what comes as we see sort of further closures and sort of realignment in the provision. I should have done that, shouldn't I? That'd have been easier, wouldn't it? There we go.
So, Karen, just on that, the number of incidents by year, month with the mental health qualifier, on that, I think if you put a trend line, that would be going up.
Yes, without a doubt. I mean, we can add that to try and give a bit better context, just for understanding, if you wish. But I mean, it's not lost on us that we're seeing mental health involvement in more incidents. And as well as that, through the training that's been done, particularly in the FCR, and the new staff who've come through in recent months are rather much more attuned to asking the right type of question to elicit the information at the outset. We do a training package which is acknowledged as being more comprehensive than the standard offer from the College of Policing, which I suppose explains how greatly we value the importance of being able to identify that at an early stage and be able to signpost to the person whether they be victim or offender, much like we discussed earlier in the investigations piece, in the right direction. But we can definitely add a trend line into that just to make it a bit more representative and sort of obvious. just probably one point of note just before I move on from mental health is we've seen a little bit of a resurgence of police transport in terms of conveyance for those who are in crisis. It's the first time we've seen that in recent months, so probably what I'll do is I'll leave that to go for this month, and if it seems to be a trend, we'll do some work and to understand that a little bit more, but it could well just be a blip. We've noted
we did see another blip about 3 months ago, didn't we?
Right.
There was another, yeah.
Might have been one that I missed.
Yeah. The detentions in York is interesting, isn't it, given the reduction in beds that we're going to see there.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean it'll be an interesting one for us, won't it, in terms of capacity around that, particularly people who are sort of north of York, as to whether they do end up ultimately going up into Teesside or across to Darlington.
Well, the Harrogate ones will have to go somewhere as well, won't they?
Yes, yeah. And they could conversely they could end up going across to sort of Keighley, Bradford, the trust there, or alternatively up to Darlington for Hambleton and Richmond more likely.
In the back of a caged police vehicle. It's not good, is it?
It isn't, and he is hoping it won't be the case, but we're as ever, we're part of that broader system, aren't we? And the prevalence of health-based places of safety are they're becoming scarcer, aren't they?
I mean, I don't know. Well, we sort of got a bit of an impasse on all of this at the minute, haven't we? And I just wondering what we do about it, really.
We're due to have a sit down later today. We've actually got some movement for CCGs.
Oh, have we?
Now, so
okay.
there's some positive.
Oh, okay, all
positive
right,
news
well,
potentially.
Right.
Not immediately, but.
Okay, all right.
Well, we'll be optimistic for the future.
Yes, be optimistic for the future. Optimism is the new thing.
Yeah. Golden age for.
Okay, to move on to crime, if I may. So as you know, we have the three. We have the slide at force level, and I'll stick with that. You'll see that numbers of incidents are rising, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I come to the control room slides in a short while, which might give some context around some of the performance in that area. Crime continues to be relatively stable in terms of the locations where it's occurring. We've got, but that's in the context of an increase. You'd have seen when the national figures came out in recent weeks, we were amongst the lowest of the forces across the country, albeit we still suffer an increase in crime, and that seems to be the tail of the tape across the whole of the country at the moment. Burglary, I think we've talked about in terms of the other presentation, in terms of the focus that gets, and you'll see it. Hopefully, you'll see violent crime in all its many guises is probably the area that exercises us the most in terms of total criminality, right the way through from the more serious sort of contact violence offending through to the, I say lower level, but lower physical impact, harassment matters and so on. Having spoken with Alan Harder in Safeguarding recently, we're starting to become more convinced that staff in the control room and staff who are out patrolling are starting to pick up more of the stalking and harassment triggers in terms of recording offences in that environment. So we're starting to see greater levels of recording there. That is going to be something that we'll continue to watch with interest over the course of the next few months, because clearly we've done a supported by your office, Commissioner, we've done the sort of the publicity campaign in the early part of the year. We backed that with local internal training, and we're really trying to push people picking that up. We're seeing more positive action as opposed to the issue, the old style issue of protection from harassment notices and so on. They've effectively been eradicated from police in practice, and we're starting to see more first up recording and then positive action being taken in terms of protection, work and safety plans. So.
This is going to sound like a silly question. It's even more obvious in the subsequent slides when you go command by command. What happens Wednesday mornings? Why is Wednesday mornings crime hotspot? Do we know?
It's midnight till 1 to 4 o'clock. Almost on every day, and I think on one command it's 4 o'clock to 7.
Yeah, do you know? I don't know. don't know the answer to that. We can go and have a look.
I think
it doesn't strike me as a normally busy time of the week.
Yeah.
Is that when all the quote recording gets done?
Well, there could be some of that because I mean, often you do get lags, don't you? If you're not busy operationally in terms of deployments, then there's an opportunity then for you to pick other work up and so on. So I mean, we can have a look at that from the FCR perspective in terms of those stats.
It does skew things slightly.
Yes. Yeah. Do you know, I never really crossed my mind in terms of...
You'll see in the next slides it's more pronounced.
Maybe it's a full moon as well.
Yeah.
But given it's over a month, something must be something in it.
Well, there's a time lag at the coast.
Yeah, slightly.
Okay to move on to the maps?
Yeah, just keep going, Kieran. We'll interject with questions.
And I've talked a little bit about increases in crime types and sort of picking up that increase in terms of violence against the person at the bottom. I know it's not the biggest percentage increase, but in terms of numbers, in so far as what impacts us, that is sort of increasing all the time, and there's a lot of work going on in terms of. Oh, sorry. I can only do one thing at a time. Sometimes 1.5. So as I say, the bare numbers in relation to violence against individuals is a concern for us, but there's a lot of work going on in terms of prevention through both the Partnership Hub and the safeguarding teams, alongside the investigative work that Jim has described going on with the operational teams to try and prevent victimisation as far as we can.
Is that including stalking?
Yeah, violence against the person, those offences, the stalking and harassment offences, drop into that bundle under the Home Office rules. Happy to carry on? I'll do this one first. And then just that picture we've added in recent months in relation to the crime.
Sorry, there's just one sorry, Kieran, there's just one question that I just... so when you refer back to the previous presentation that we had around investigations, and the amount of times it's taking for investigations in the county in comparison to other areas. And then you start to look at these statistics as well, and the average number of officers and time spent. You start to get a bit of a picture of perhaps some of the reasons why, because there's fewer resources per incident and the amount of time spent is longer. So I wonder whether actually it's just a feature of the nature of the way that resourcing is deployed in county.
Yeah, I think of necessity, and Jim hopefully may back me up. Hint. I think of necessity in county.
But it's really it could be really helpful actually, because it could start, because we're always saying that it's more expensive to provide per head of population a service in a large rural area because of the geography challenges, and actually this data could be starting to provide some substance behind that.
I mean, I think we're obviously really keen to maintain a footprint in as many geographical places as we can across all of the parts of the county command. But inevitably what that often means is that officers are single crewed, or maybe one officer trades on for duty at a particular location and covers a bigger area. Yeah. So you do get a time lag in terms of. I spent some time at Stokesley on Friday, Saturday, Sunday across the weekend. And often it is the case that it's a singular officer briefing on, so they get the crime list for the day, and the crime list is completely on them. So that there is that element in terms of that initial response, which is slower, and the number of officers aligned to an incident might be slightly different as a consequence.
What I can say is, from my experience, I was a Whitley Bridge beat officer down south of Selby, and my investigations did take longer than when I was a Selby Town PC. And the reason is because you were single crew, massive geography, and all the travelling. When you're in an urban environment or a town, city environment, there's more of you.
Exactly, but this is the argument that we're always trying to mount at a national level around the nature of policing a geography like North Yorkshire in comparison to an urban area. And we always struggle to evidence what we're saying, and actually it is interesting, because I bet if you started to look at it from that perspective, you might start to see some of the evidence coming through in this. And we've always struggled to mount our argument. And if we're trying to mount an argument at the moment for our fair share of additional police officers, then these are the types of things that, the types of information and data that we need to use to enable us to actually have those arguments.
No,
So it'd be just a really interesting way of trying to look at the data.
We have to understand it though, don't we?
Yes, exactly.
So I think it's important to remember that the police officer and the PCSO in those local communities plays a different role as well. They don't necessarily just play that. If we were just working it out on the basis of incidents reported, well, we would never have a police station in Stokesley. But we work it out on the basis not only of incidents reported, we work it out on the sense of community and bringing people together by having police stations in that locality as an iconic location, and the reassurance that provides not only to the people who live in Stokesley but the people who live in Great Ayton and the other villages around, because they know that the police are there and available. And that's the same if you go across into Craven to Skipton and Grassington and so on. So it's trying to, I think, introduce into the debate that broader role that the service plays in rural communities than just necessarily crime prevention or crime investigation.
But it would be very interesting with the county command data if you stripped Harrogate out of it, because that's where you've got, because obviously you've got your highest concentration of population, and looked at it without Harrogate to start to see the average amount of resources per incident, the amount average minutes per incident. You start to see quite an interesting picture there that I think could be quite helpful.
Would you like us to do some work with the office just to see if we can pick that out with next, just have a chat outside the meeting and see what we can do? Because I think it's not just Harrogate, it could necessarily be Richmond, for example.
Precisely,
There's got some conurbations there that you could draw out and then pick out what does it look like in the other parts.
Yeah.
That might help us in terms of service design as well.
Yeah. Sorry. Right.
No.
You're going to run out of your 15 minutes, aren't you? So we're going to have to zip through
So
this.
the crime map is obviously one that we've presented before and just gives hopefully a better presentation for members of the public to see, which is tracked also in relation to the antisocial behaviour piece that we have. There's the next slide. I don't think there's a massive amount to pick out from there. Probably just to pick out in terms of proactivity, if I may. Discussed as we picked up in the other element about border vulnerability and crime activity. Our roads police and operational support and firearms support teams spend significant amount of their time trying to reinforce our borders. You'll see the light blue on the slide is there to demonstrate just the amount of effort that goes in that regard to try and make it as safe as we can.
So you click not one.
It's stopped. Yeah.
Press the button.
Which one do you want to go to?
We'll do 999 call information, please.
That one.
So sorry, can I just pick up one thing first of all? In comparison to last month, the ASB, interestingly enough, the burglary data on the crime map is better in some places. You know that's coming down. Just to note though that the ASB data on the other is going so whereas it's significantly less in June, it's actually creeping back towards zero. So just to kind of flag that, you know, there may be statistical reasons for that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, but just to flag that it was, so for example in Harrogate it was just shy of 20% last month, and now it's at 11%.
So we'd need to look at last year's figures, wouldn't we, to make sure it's not seasonal because of the summer or school holidays.
Quite possibly, quite possibly. But just to flag that.
Yeah. So rather than previous month comparison, is then also comparing it to last year's trends. Yeah.
Happy to move on?
Yeah.
And very quickly, if I can, I'll just pick out the sort of highlights highlights or the important information within the force control room is we're seeing performance is dropping off in terms of speed of answer, and has done over the last few months. That is in the context, and it's the same I think for 999 and 101 calls across the two slides. That is in the context of continued increased volumes for calls right the way across the force, which is being seen right the way across the whole service nationally. Exacerbated locally, I would say, by some of the changes that we've got in place. We've got a number of individuals leaving the organisation and have been on their sort of departure leave as they take voluntary redundancy linked to work that's going on internally. We moved to a new shift pattern in August, so we've been, for want of a better phrase, limping along with the old pattern as we've lost some numbers of staff, and that's impacted resilience. Annette is having swapped the portfolios over. Annette is leading effectively the gold group response to that to give us resilience across the remainder of the summer. We moved to the new shift pattern in about 12 or 13 days, 2 weeks on Mondays, 12th of August. So work is ongoing to ensure that we shore up performance in that area whilst we move people to the new teams and make sure we've got recruiting and numbers in the right place at the right time.
So if it's possible to be included in that in some way, it'd be really helpful. We are starting to get complaints coming into the OPCC again, and people are quick to complain on this when it drops.
I mean,
I know all the reasons, but
yeah. This will reflect what you said, but getting the benefit of seeing the calls every day on the COT log, it's just inconsistent like I haven't seen it before, where the average day might be an 8-minute wait and then it'll be down to 60 seconds and then 4 minutes and then 9 minutes, then a minute again, and it's the sort of inconsistency that seems different.
One of the issues around that is we run the existing shift pattern is in place and it's rigid, but the staff who are leaving aren't necessarily leaving in the same measure from each team. So some teams are more affected than others, and sometimes what you have the team with the fewest available staff alongside the highest call volume number, and performance obviously drops more significantly, and then we can have better days where we've got higher numbers of staff on and lower call volume. So we've got a rebalancing act in place, and that through the team has got really strong measures in place to get us across the next few months.
All right. Okay, great. I am really conscious. I don't want fire to have no time. So, is there anything that you'd like to draw our attention to, Kieran?
No, I think hopefully I've covered that to satisfaction, and I'm happy with the last slide there.
Okay. Can I just ask Simon, have we got any questions from members of the public?
No.
Right. Okay. So then you're good to go till the end. Thank you.
Shall I just skim through?
Yeah, keep going.
These?
Yeah. Sorry.
Is that?
There's some slides, but you can just go.
Yes, you want a glossary of police terms.
talk through HR from the police, yeah? There you go. Okay, so this is the quarterly performance report from Fire. And what this one now shows, because this is in its third month of reporting, we've now got 3 month comparisons on this one. So in June we had 528 calls, which is a decreasing trend over the 3 month period. Not significantly, but it is lower than it was in April. The graph on the bottom left hand side shows the types of call and when they were, and it shows that the demand is at its greatest between 8 o'clock in the morning and 8 p.m. at night. And then the graph next to there where it's got green and red, this was something which we put in which was from the last plan, where it demonstrates our availability levels compared with where the demand is. One thing worth noting on there is that we only use the operational staffing reserves to supplement crewing between 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock at night generally. So where we've got the green spikes there, that is our availability levels without any supplementation by the operational
That's
staff reserve.
interesting.
If we took the ops staff reserve out, I suspect we would see almost a reserve of where, a reverse of where the demand is, which suggests that the demand is where in the day and our normal availability levels without the ops staff reserve would be very low during the day.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It shows the value of the ops staff
Yeah.
reserve at the moment,
Yeah,
albeit inefficient.
yeah.
When we look at the graphs to the right hand side, automatic fire alarms, or false alarms I should say, are still in the high area demand, and the three busy districts are still York, Scarborough, Harrogate respectively. Are there any questions on that slide?
Well, actually, Will makes a good point. So, just on the top left there, the difference between this year and last year.
Yeah.
It's completely. It is the inverse in terms of fires.
It is.
Number of fires going up, number of fires coming down.
It is. Yeah.
And the other two don't seem to be particularly different.
That's right. In May, in April, we had a very dry April. If you remember when we first reported this, it was largely attributed to the weather, and we had a really hot Easter, which attracted lots of calls. I can't quite remember what Easter was like in 2018.
It was very wet.
It may well, was it?
It was. The cricket season was abandoned for the whole of April. Local leagues.
I'm not suggesting that that's definitely it, but it often weather conditions can affect the calls. But it is, you're quite right, Tom. Special services and false alarms are generally the same, but fires is the reverse almost of fires compared to 2018. Moving on to the next slide, the fire overview. The roundup figures for the 3 months are 227 secondary fires and 268 primary fires. And actually broken into the month, it was 56 and 95 for June. Deliverance is still the highest cause. And we are working with partners to understand why this is. So there's two factors here. One still is down to the reporting of accurate information to say whether it was deliberate or accidental, and that's coming down to crew training, which we are picking up on. And the second one is where we know that there is a problem. For example, I'll give you in Jennyfields area in Harrogate recently, we had known deliberate fires, and so we've been working within the community safety hub there locally with the police to drive down those within Harrogate area. So there's a range of different things going on both in the districts where these are affected. The other side of this is that we need to be able to provide data which drills right down into local station area, and our data teams, we've got a vacancy in there at the moment, so we are struggling to provide that type of quality information, but that's where we aspire to be. Moving on to our overall availability. Sorry, was there any questions on the fires overview at all? So, overall availability is slightly up in June compared to May, 88% as opposed to 87% previously, and on-call availability is the same, 82%. So not a deteriorating as I suspected, but coming to some holiday period, it's something we've got to be really careful to keep an eye on it with the on-call service. We managed to maintain the core of availability within the optimum crane levels, which is between 38 and 45 appliances available. There were a few occasions where we dropped into the critical levels, but there's 4 occasions there on that graph shown on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side there, the bottom graph where it shows quarterly on-call availability, some real challenges in there for Summerbridge, Sherburn and Helmsley particularly, struggling with crewing, struggling with availability in those areas, but nonetheless with the staff that have got, they're still performing extremely well and giving good commitment, but 4.5 staff at Summerbridge, it's going to be a real struggle.
Are you expecting that availability to potentially improve once TRB's back on station and they'll have the ability to crew as well?
That's something which we would like to move towards. We need to consider where the TRBs are best placed to go on the on-call station. We've now got TRBs back on the road at Harrogate and Scarborough. There's another 4 which we need to identify the most appropriate place for those. If it was one of these stations, then yes, we would naturally like to see it improve as a result of being there. But that's still work ongoing, and there's no decisions made on that one at all.
So, so Summerbridge. You've got Summerbridge. What's the Ripon the nearest?
So Summerbridge will be Harrogate the nearest spot there, and then Grassington going the other way, Masson to the north.
Right.
Yeah. And then of course Ripon would spawn as well.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we had discussions earlier in the week. We have a local agreement set up with Menwith Hill, the fire crews at Menwith Hill, who we have an agreement whereby they will respond locally into a permitted area from the base there. So we've had some quite good conversations earlier in the week to see if we can do some work there to try and support Summerbridge whilst we've got these difficulties with crewing.
Can they get off the base quick enough?
They've got permanent fire cover on the base. So.
No, I mean physically get off the base quick enough. You know what I mean? Because of all the security.
I think you can get off
Yeah, you
easily
can get
enough.
off,
It's getting
yeah.
back in.
And for a number of years they have been responding locally to road traffic collisions
Yeah,
and such, in addition to local authority.
Yeah. I suppose with an RTC though, I imagine that the response, if you've got police and all the rest of it responding to that, for a house fire you've got to get mobilised really quick, haven't you?
We would mobilise as quick as regardless.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is just an overview of home fire safety and business safety. So the left-hand chart at the top there demonstrates the work that the blue is the community safety officers undertaking the work. The orange is where we've got whole-time crews undertaking home fire risk checks as well and safe and well visits. Craven, there are no whole-time staff over there, so naturally it falls to the community safety officers to do the work, but good work going on. Harrogate, we have had a vacancy, we've now filled that vacancy within the community safety officers, so we should see a different balance going forward, and I would like to therefore, once that's done, we should see more work on the opposite table whereby Harrogate operational crews will divert their focus onto business safety.
I was going to ask that.
In terms of overall visits within the quarter, 509 home fire risk checks, 362 safe and well, and of those, interestingly, 36%, 312 without a working smoke alarm, and 17% of those were smokers. So it's still a significant proportion without smoke alarms working when we are visiting. The theme still remains houses in multiple occupancy for the business safety within this period. So the crews are focusing their attentions on visiting those types of property. Just one update on the business safety overview. We had another successful prosecution this week. This was a nightclub in Harrogate this time, whereby someone was burnt with open candles. We weren't called to the incident at all, but afterwards someone was severely burnt. and that was then reported to us. We went along, investigated, and found that even though this occurrence had happened a number of days later, they hadn't adjusted anything at all. So they went to court, they were prosecuted for failure to have a satisfactory risk assessment, and one of the counts within fire safety measures.
General fire precautions.
General fire precautions. They received a fine of £22,000 and just short of £9,000 costs. Any questions on that side at all?
But you can't just turn up and audit somewhere, but I presume.
No, and this is one of the difficulties with the houses in multiple occupancy in particular, because we need to trace down the landlord effectively. If it's a local authority premises or a housing provider, generally we can make good contact with them, but where it's a private landlord, private tenanted landlord with IMOs, that can create a problem in trying to track down the relevant people, and it is causing an awful lot of time for the crews to actually do that in preparation to be able to go out and do the audits.
Without tarring everyone with the same brush, but given your prosecutions and what these things say, you can be targeting, although you can't really target licensed premises, boarding schools, hostels.
Yeah, you've got to look at the numbers though, Will. So on the boarding school there's only 3.
I know,
Yeah.
but they've audited, of which 2/3 are. You can look at it different ways, can't you? But
really good figures is if every property that we audited resulted in enforcement action, I'd be over the moon, because that would be in one hand it would be because it would be demonstrating that we were targeting our work well, on the other hand it would give me a concern that there's lots of properties out there that aren't compliant. But again, in terms of performance and how we target our work, we look at this data, we look at where we've had fires, the severity of those fires, and it's all of that data that gets fed into our property database that says, okay, next year these are the types of property that we're going to target, and these are the ones that we're going to hit.
And actually, licensed premises is the next one which we'll be going for.
Yeah,
that is the next. That is the next theme. Once we've done the housing, and it was for that very reason.
Yeah.
And I guess what it might be interesting to see as part of this is what were you expecting? So is this on the basis of a complaint or not? Therefore, when you went in, did you find that it was actually unsatisfactory, or was it actually up to standard? Because I guess some in terms of what you're saying, there might be something in looking at it in that light.
like a stop and search outcome.
Yeah, potentially.
Well, we can, for licensed premises, we have got the ability to go and do during performance inspections, and that will form part, once we move on to that theme, we will be able to go and do during performance inspections. The next slide gives a health and safety overview. Nothing significant on there of any concerns in terms of trends. One interesting one there, the violence to staff, was an incident at Ripon Fire Station, stroke police station, where a member of the public came along wanting to speak to a police officer, nobody there because they were out doing other police work, and became very agitated towards the fire crews that opened the door.
So that was a concern that would happen, wasn't it? So presumably that has been followed up on then, I would imagine.
Yeah, we put some control measures in, particularly when we've got lone workers on station.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, we don't want that could. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, let's hope it's an isolated case, but it's still one which we've acted upon. And then finally, this was the staff sickness and absence overview. Interestingly there, the top left-hand columns there, this shows 2019 quarter one to 2018 quarter one. Shift stations, sickness has been up in terms of total shift loss. Day crew stations, it's actually lower this year than it was last year. The shift station one is largely due to a number of isolated cases where there have been some accidents, unfortunately, attributable to long-term sickness. And then the on-call sickness, the number of days lost is very similar to 2018.
It would be quite helpful to see this in comparison to other services as well. Please, having seen some relatively interesting data for the police recently, which I passed on to Phil, it would be useful to see this in relation to other services.
That's a good point. Looking towards doing that.
And the HMI will help us to do that, of course, because they will be comparing and they'll do their State of the Nation. Because I agree that sometimes the numbers in isolation, so we've done 1,000 visits, so what? It's the effectiveness of those visits, the difference it makes. And I think there's also a bit to compare ourselves to other fire and rescue services, because it might be, as Dave said, that because we've got lots of shift-based people trained to do fire safety audits, we do a higher number than proportionally than other places. But then I look at the number of home fire safety visits and safe and well visits, and I know of other fire services who are doing significantly more than us. So part of it's comparing output, the numbers we do, but I think I keep coming back to it. The most important bit is the quality of them and how effective they are. How well targeted they are, how good quality the work is, and what scale of a difference does it make to that person's likelihood to suffer a fire or another sort of incident.
Right. Is that it? Simon, have you got anything?
No.
No? Okay. Anybody got any other business? No? Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody.